On the morning of September 18, 1944, a 19-year-old Marine from Portland, Oregon, took off his helmet and set it down in the coral. He unshouldered his pack, he unwrapped his canvas leggings and dropped them beside the helmet. Everything heavy, everything that might slow him down, gone. Then he picked up his Browning automatic rifle and started crawling toward 35 Japanese soldiers waiting inside a concrete bunker. 90 minutes later, that bunker was rubble. So were 11 others along a 200-yard stretch of coral ridge. Approximately 50 Japanese soldiers were dead. And Arthur Jackson, bleeding from the neck, was sitting in the dirt of a Pacific island most Americans have never heard of, wondering how he was still alive. His officers watched it happen with their mouths open. They gave him the Medal of Honor for what he did that morning. President Harry Truman placed the pale blue ribbon around his neck in the East Room of the White House. And then Arthur Jackson spent the next 73 years refusing to talk about it. This is the reason why. His name was Arthur Jr. Jackson. He was born on October 18, 1924, in Cleveland, Ohio. His family moved to Canton, then across the country to Portland, Oregon in 1939, chasing work in the middle of the Great Depression. He was quiet, not shy. Quiet in the way certain boys become quiet when they have already decided to be measured by what they do, not by what they say. He graduated from Grant High School. He took a job wiring electrical systems for a naval construction company up in Alaska. Then Pearl Harbor came, and he waited until he was old enough. In January of 1943, at 18 years old, Arthur Jackson walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office in Portland and signed his name. Every town in America had a boy like this in 1943. Every town. Boot camp at San Diego. Then a troop transport across the Pacific. Then Melbourne, Australia, where the 1st Marine Division was licking its wounds from Guadalcanal. Jackson was assigned to a machine gun team. Belt fed .30 caliber. Crew served. Heavy weapon, he hated it, not the danger. The weight. The waiting. A machine gunner waits for orders, waits for cover, waits for the assistant gunner to feed the belt. Jackson did not want to wait. He wanted to move. The 1st Marine Division came ashore at Cape Gloucester on the island of New Britain on December 26, 1943. Christmas dinner had been served the day before on a Navy destroyer. Then the ramps dropped and the men walked into a jungle so thick they could not see each other. Jackson's company lost 17 men to snipers and tripwires in the first days. He carried his machine gun through mud that swallowed him to the knees. And on one afternoon in that jungle campaign, on an exposed slope under Japanese fire, Arthur Jackson did something that got him noticed. A fellow Marine went down in the open, wounded, bleeding. Jackson set aside his machine gun. He went out under fire and brought the wounded man back. The Marine lived. Jackson received a letter of commendation. His officers marked his name. And here is the first thing about him that nobody has ever fully explained. When the campaign ended, when the papers were being cut for reassignment, Arthur Jackson did not ask to be moved to a safer position. He asked for the opposite. He asked to be transferred out of the machine gun team into a rifle platoon. He asked for a Browning automatic rifle, the Bay R, 20-round magazine, roughly 19 pounds of walnut and steel. And in a rifle platoon, the BR man walks at the front. The BR man draws the enemy's first fire. Because if you kill the BR, you kill the squad's ability to suppress. He asked for the more dangerous job. He never fully explained why. That was the man his country was about to send to Peleliu. By the summer of 1944, the American war machine had turned its face toward the Palau Islands. The plan was called Operation Stalemate 2. Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted the airfield on Peleliu as a staging area for General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Command of the ground assault fell to Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division. Rupertus was 55 years old, a career officer hungry for the victory that would define his war. The day before the landings, he stood before his officers and told them what to expect. He told them the operation would be short, rough, but fast. 3 days, maybe 2. He was wrong by 70. The Marines climbed down cargo nets into landing craft on the morning of September 15th, 1944. Arthur Jackson stood in a Higgins boat watching the naval bombardment tear the beach apart. Rocket ships fired volleys that turned the sky orange. 14-inch shells arched over their heads. Jackson tilted his chin up to watch, and his platoon leader barked at him to keep his head down. The landing was chaos from the first minute. The tracked amphibious vehicles that were supposed to carry them over the coral reef did not come. The landing craft driver dropped his ramp in 7 feet of water, hundreds of yards from shore. Jackson jumped. His boots hit the coral bottom. Water closed over his head. He tilted his face up, pushed off the sand, sank again. Around him, other Marines were doing the same. Their packs dragged them down, their rifles filled with salt water. Jackson turned to his assistant, Barman, a boy he had trained with for months, and said 7 words: "We run, and we don't stop." They ran. Bullets cracked past their ears. Marines went down in the surf and did not come up. Jackson kept running. Bear held over his head to keep it dry. Legs burning, lungs burning, the whole island burning. He reached the beach. He kept going. By nightfall, on that first day, nearly 1,300 Marines had been killed or wounded on Peleliu. And the reason nobody in American command had seen it coming was that nobody in American command understood what waited for them. The Japanese commander on Peleliu was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, 46 years old, commander of the 2nd Infantry Regiment. About 10,900 defenders under his authority. He was not the loud kind of officer. He was not the fanatic Americans had been trained to expect. He was an engineer, a tactician, a man who had studied every Pacific Island battle and drawn a hard conclusion. The old way of fighting was suicide. Banzai charges did not work. Beach defenses did not work. Every time the Japanese massed on the shoreline and rushed the Marines head-on, they died in windrows and accomplished nothing. Nakagawa did the opposite. He pulled his defenders back from the beach. He dug them into the coral. He connected caves with tunnels. He built more than 500 reinforced positions across the island in ridges so twisted no map could fully render them. Concrete pillboxes with walls 3 feet thick and firing slits arranged so that each position covered its neighbor. Ammunition stocked for months. He was not going to attack the Marines, and he was going to make them pay every yard. And American intelligence had almost for every yard. Rupertus and his staff had spent weeks studying aerial photographs that showed jungle. They did not know that under that jungle, cut into the limestone, was a fortress. By the morning of September 18th, the 1st Marine Regiment had lost 70% of its landing strength. 7 out of every 10 men who had crossed that beach 3 days earlier were dead or wounded or being carried off the line. Arthur Jackson's regiment, the 7th Marines, had pushed into the southern sector. Their mission on paper was simple: clear the Japanese defensive positions blocking the advance toward the airfield. The problem was the pillboxes, 12 of them, arranged in a rough arc across the southern peninsula. Marines had already tried grenades. The grenades bounced off the concrete. They had tried rifle fire. The bullets sparked and ricocheted. They had tried rushing the firing slits. The bodies piled up in front of the walls. The standard solution was tanks. The terrain was too steep. The standard solution was artillery. The Marines were pinned too close. The standard solution was to wait and coordinate and try again. Waiting was killing men. And this is where the real story begins. Jackson's platoon, 2nd Platoon of I Company, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, had advanced about 200 yards that morning before the left flank collapsed. One pillbox dominated the approach. Every time a Marine so much as lifted his head, the pillbox fired. 3 men had already tried to find a way around it. All 3 were dead in the coral, their bodies visible from where Jackson lay flat behind a boulder, watching the flies gather. Then he heard boots behind him. He turned his head. 3 officers were crawling toward his position. The platoon leader, the company commander of I Company, and the weapons officer from the 3rd Battalion. 3 men who did not travel together unless the situations had gone past desperate. They gathered in the shallow depression behind Jackson's boulder. Sweat streaked their faces. The company commander pointed at the pillbox. He pointed at a shallow trench that snaked forward through the coral toward the enemy line, a fold in the ground barely deep enough to hide a man on his belly. If he could get out to that trench, he was told he could do some damage. The officers did not order him, they asked. And here Arthur Jackson did not answer with words. He reached up to his head and unbuckled his helmet. He set it down in the coral. He unshouldered his pack. He unwrapped his canvas leggings and dropped them beside the helmet. Everything heavy, everything that might slow him down, gone. He kept his bayar. He kept 2 bandoliers of ammunition slung across his chest. He kept his grenades, fragmentation grenades, in one pocket, white phosphorus grenades in the other. White phosphorus, the stuff that burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and cannot be extinguished with water, because when the water evaporates, the phosphorus reignites. 19 years old, 150 yards of open coral in front of him, a concrete bunker holding 35 Japanese soldiers waiting to kill him, and behind him an entire flank of Marines who could not move until someone did what he was about to do. Arthur Jackson did not say a word. He rolled onto his belly. He started to crawl. The coral cut him from the first yard. It was not sand and not stone, but something crueler, something honed by a million years of ocean into edges that sliced through his dungaree trousers and opened thin red lines along his forearms. He barely felt it. A man does not feel small pain when he is crawling toward a large one. The air above him cracked with rifle fire, not aimed at him, not yet. The Japanese in the pillbox did not know he was there. Every crack of a Type 92 machine gun sent a spray of coral chips into the air 10 yards to his right. Every burst reminded him that if any one of those gunners turned his weapon 2 degrees to the left, Jackson would be dead before he heard the sound. He kept crawling. The trench, when he reached it, was barely a trench at all. A fold in the coral, chest deep in some places, ankle deep in others. But it went forward. He slid into it. He pulled his BR against his shoulder. He tasted salt and dust and the coppery tang of his own bleeding forearms. 150 yards. That was the distance between him and the largest Japanese pillbox on the southern peninsula. He could not see the men inside. He could hear them. Voices carrying through the aperture on the hot morning air. Men speaking in a language he did not understand, laughing at something. Jackson took a breath. He started to crawl again. The first thing he heard when he got close was the metal, ammunition belts being fed into machine guns, the click of bolts, the soft scrape of a rifle stock against concrete, the sounds men make when they are comfortable in their fortress. Then he heard the 2 sentries. Not inside the pillbox, outside it, standing casually on either side of the main entrance, rifles across their chests, watching the wrong direction. They were watching the Marine lines. They were not watching the shallow trench that snaked up toward their blind side. Jackson raised the Bayar. He fired 1 short burst, then another. Both sentries dropped without ever seeing the man who killed them. The voices inside the pillbox went quiet for a moment. Then they started shouting. Boots scrambled on concrete. A machine gun swung inside its mount, searching for a target it could not find. Jackson pressed his back against the outer wall of the pillbox. He was so close now that he could hear a Japanese officer barking orders on the other side of 3 feet of concrete. He could smell the cordite. He could feel the heat radiating off the wall where the sun had been baking it since dawn. And then, behind him, he heard boots in the trench. He turned his head. His squad leader was crawling toward him, bandoliers across his chest, a satchel over one shoulder, and in the satchel, wrapped in canvas, 40 pounds of composition C2 plastic explosive and a small wooden box of No. 4 blasting caps. The squad leader reached him and pressed the satchel into his hands without a word. 2 men, alone against 35, with enough explosive between them to level a small house. Jackson looked at the satchel. He looked at the firing slit above his head. He knew exactly what to do. He pulled the pin on a white phosphorus grenade. He held it for a heartbeat, counting silently. Then he stood up, shoved the grenade through the firing slit, and dropped back down before the men inside could recover. The screaming started immediately. White phosphorus does not kill quickly. It burns. It burns through skin, through cloth, through flesh, at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Men inside that pillbox began stumbling toward the entrance, their uniforms on fire, their ammunition belts cooking off around their waists, rounds exploding inside their own gear. Jackson raised his BAR. He cut them down as they came out. But 35 men had been inside that box. The phosphorus had killed some. His BAR had killed more. There were still men in there, men firing back through secondary aperture, men who had retreated into the deepest corners and would keep firing until they were dead. Jackson turned to his squad leader. He held out his hands for the satchel. 40 pounds of C2, No. 4, blasting cap. 30-second time fuse. He crimped the cap. He pushed it into the block of explosive. He pressed his thumb against the fuse and lit it with a hiss. He stood up. He shoved the entire satchel through the firing slit. He turned. He ran. dove into a shell crater 10 yards behind the pillbox and curled into a ball, arms over his head, face pressed against the coral. The world lifted, the pillbox lifted with it. Concrete slabs the size of coffins went spinning through the air, wooden beams, sand. A cloud of debris blossomed 60 feet into the sky and hung there for a moment before it began to rain down. A chunk of concrete the size of a football landed 6 inches from Jackson's head with a heavy thud he felt through his sternum. When the dust settled, the pillbox was gone. 35 Japanese soldiers were dead. Jackson lifted his face out of the dirt. He was still alive. He should have stopped there. Any Marine will tell you this. Any officer who ever wrote a field manual will tell you this. The mission had been to neutralize the position holding up the left flank. The position was neutralized. The platoon could now advance. Jackson had done what the 3 officers had asked him to do, and he had done it in less than 15 minutes of one September morning, and the only correct next move was to crawl back to friendly lines, deliver his report, and let someone else finish the day. He did not do it. He rolled onto his back in the shell crater and looked at the sky. He listened to his own breathing. He listened, farther out, to the sound of Japanese machine guns still firing from other positions. 200 yards ahead of him, 11 more pillboxes still poured fire into the Marine lines. 11 more concrete boxes full of men who were going to keep killing his brothers until someone stopped them. He knew who was in a position to stop. Art Jackson checked his BAR. He checked his remaining grenades. He climbed out of the crater. He started walking toward the next pillbox, and here is where the story stops being about a battle and starts being about a man. The record is careful, and honesty demands we be careful with it. Arthur Jackson's Medal of Honor citation, signed by President Truman, records the facts in the language of official praise. He advanced alone under continuous fire. He employed similar means, phosphorus and explosives, and his automatic rifle, to smash 2 smaller positions in the immediate vicinity. He stormed one gun position after another, dealing death and destruction to the savagely fighting enemy in his inexorable drive against the remaining defenses. 12 pillboxes, approximately 50 Japanese soldiers. 90 minutes. That is what the record says, and the record is enough, but the record does not tell you what it felt like. The second pillbox was smaller than the first. 5 defenders, 2 machine guns. He approached it from the flank, where a rise in the coral blocked the firing slit's angle. His squad leader followed with more explosives. Jackson threw phosphorus through the aperture. The rest was mathematics. The third pillbox went the same way. By the fourth, the Japanese in the remaining positions had figured out what was happening. They could not see who was killing them. They could only see the smoke rising from bunker after bunker along their own defensive line. They began firing wildly in every direction. Some of their bullets came close to Jackson. Some came close to the Marines behind him, who were now beginning to move up through the gaps he was creating. Some hit their own men in adjacent positions. The interlocking fields of fire that Colonel Nakagawa had designed so carefully, the fields of fire that were supposed to make every pillbox protect every other pillbox, were coming apart, because pillboxes cannot see behind them, and Jackson was behind them. By the 5th position, his weapon began to fail him. The Browning automatic rifle is a magnificent gun. It is almost a temperamental one. Its receiver runs hot fast, and the coral dust of Peleliu had been working its way into every seam and every spring since the day of the landing. Jackson had fired hundreds of rounds through it in less than half an hour, and the barrel had reached a temperature that burned his hands through the wooden foregrip. The Bayard jammed. He dropped behind a coral outcrop, laid the weapon across his knees, and cleared it under fire. Fingers slick with sweat and blood and black smoke residue. He racked the bolt. He blew across the receiver to clear the dust. Bullets cracked over his head from a Japanese position he could not see. He got the weapon working. He kept moving. 3 positions later, it jammed again. He cleared it again. There was no drama in this, only patience. The patience of a 19-year-old boy from Portland, Oregon, who had learned as a teenager that jobs get done by men who do not stop when the work is unpleasant. And here, somewhere between the 5th pillbox and the 8th, the strangest thing about the whole day began to reveal itself. The Japanese never came out. They had the numbers to come out. They had the training. Colonel Nakagawa had reserves, officers with radios, a tunnel network that could have delivered dozens of fresh soldiers to the ridge in minutes. If they had massed against the single Marine walking down their defensive line, they would have overwhelmed him. He was one man. He was out of position. He was exposed. He was, in strictly military terms, an easy problem to solve. They did not solve it. Decades later, when a schoolteacher asked Arthur Jackson to explain what happened that day, he shook his head and said something that has stayed with historians ever since. To this day, I do not understand why they didn't vacate some of those positions and come out after me. They must have thought there was more than one person doing all this. That was the closest he ever came to explaining the miracle. They did not believe he was alone. They thought a battalion was rolling up their line. They thought there were teams of Marines flanking every position. They stayed inside their concrete boxes because their concrete boxes were the safest place they knew, and their commanders had told them to hold. And they held until the phosphorus came through the slit, and they died where they stood. One man, moving faster than their imagination could keep up with, had broken their picture of the battle. The heat became a weapon too. The temperature on Peleliu that morning climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water canteens ran dry. Salt tablets were useless without water to swallow them. Jackson had been running, crawling, and fighting for over an hour under a sun that felt like a fourth enemy on the field. His vision began to shimmer at the edges. His hands began to shake. Years later, when he spoke to students at a high school living history day in Milwaukee, Oregon, he did not describe the pillboxes. He did not describe the men he killed. He described what his uniform looked like when it was over. It was so horribly hot and humid, he said, and we had very little water. We looked so ragged when we got off that island. He laughed then, in the way old men laugh at the absurdities they have survived. I could not take off my pants because the hair on my legs had grown through my pant legs, so I had to cut my pants off. The room of teenagers went quiet. They did not know what to do with the image, neither did the Marine sitting beside him. That was Peleliu. That was the war. That was the generation your father might have belonged to. That was the generation your grandfather might have been. Somewhere in the last third of that 90 minutes, he was hit. The bullet was a .45 caliber round. Where it came from, whether from a Japanese soldier who had acquired an American pistol or from a piece of stray fire in the chaos of the battle, was never determined. What was determined was where it struck him. It hit him in the neck. The round passed through the soft tissue on one side of his throat without hitting artery, spine, or windpipe. Somebody was watching over Arthur Jackson that morning. Whatever, you believe in something. He kept fighting. At some point in the final minutes, he ran out of ammunition. The Browning automatic rifle clicked on an empty chamber. His last magazine was gone. His grenades were mostly gone. A Marine rifle squad had pushed forward on his right, exploiting the gaps he had opened. Their sergeant took one look at Jackson out of ammunition and made the only decision that mattered. He signaled his men forward. He put his squad on line with the one man who had already broken the enemy's back. Together, they finished it. Not because Jackson could not have finished it alone. The record suggests he could have, and probably would have, but because Marines do not let one of their own bleed out finishing a fight they should be finishing beside him. The last of the 12 pillboxes went silent shortly after 9 in the morning. Jackson lowered his BR. His legs stopped working the way legs are supposed to. He sat down in the coral. He looked at his hands, which were shaking. He looked at the sky, which was very blue. He looked at the smoke rising from 12 broken bunkers along a 200-yard stretch of southern Peleliu. The Marines around him began to shout his name. They shouted it the way boys shout when a teammate has scored the winning run at a Little League game. They lifted him up. They slapped his shoulders. His feet did not quite touch the ground. Somewhere in that celebration, his body finally gave out. Heat exhaustion. Blood loss. The kind of exhaustion that has no name because it belongs only to men who have spent 90 minutes in the state. Arthur Jackson had just spent them in. He collapsed backward onto the coral. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the sun and the smoke and the faces of the Marines he had just saved, looking down at him like he was something they did not quite understand. He did not understand it either. He woke on a hospital ship. The USS Solace, a white vessel with a red cross painted on her side, floating in the calm water off Peleliu, catching the men the beach could not keep. Corpsmen moved through the wards in soft-soled shoes. Fans turned the sheets on his cot with the first clean cloth Arthur Jackson had touched in 3 weeks. He had been on Peleliu for 1 week. That was all. 7 days on that coral island. One morning of 90 minutes that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Solace took him to Noumea in New Caledonia. 3 weeks in a hospital ward with palm trees outside the windows and mosquitoes at night. Then transport to the Russell Islands for training. Then back to the war. Because the war was not finished with him. On the island he had left behind, the killing continued. The Marines needed 73 days to secure Peleliu. Not 3, as Major General Rupertus had promised. 73 days of coral and heat and cave after cave that had to be sealed with flamethrowers because the men inside would not surrender. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the Japanese engineer who had built the fortress, held out until the very end. On the 24th of November, 1944, with his defensive network reduced to a few final caves in the northern ridges, Nakagawa and Major General Kenjiro Murai committed ritual suicide together, side by side, rather than surrender. 3 days later, the island was declared secure. The final count was almost too painful to read. 1,800 American Marines dead, over 8,000 wounded. 10,700 Japanese defenders killed, with only a handful taken prisoner. Historians would later debate whether the island had needed to be taken at all. Those debates would happen in air-conditioned university offices decades later. They would not undo the 1,800 families that received folded flags. And they would not, could not, diminish what men like Arthur Jackson had done in the Coral. Because a Marine does not choose his war. He only chooses how he fights it. Arthur Jackson did not know any of these debates yet. He would not know them for years. He healed. He trained. He went back. Okinawa was the last great battle of the Pacific War, and it was worse than Peleliu. Jackson landed with the 1st Marine Division in April of 1945, now a platoon sergeant, promoted for the work he had done in the Coral. He fought through the mud and the rain and the ridges. On the 18th of May, exactly 8 months to the day since his 90 minutes on Peleliu, he was hit again. Another neck wound, the opposite side this time, another round that missed the artery by a fraction. His fellow Marines, watching him come back a second time with his neck wrapped in white gauze, began calling him the only true leatherneck in the outfit. It was a grim joke. It was also, for those who understood, a kind of love. In August of 1945, while Jackson was still recovering, 2 atomic bombs ended the war he had been fighting since he was 18 years old. That same month, the Marine Corps commissioned him a 2nd lieutenant, 20 years old, 2 Purple Hearts, and now an officer. On the 5th of October, 1945, Arthur Jackson stood in the East Room of the White House. He wore his dress blues, his hair was cut short, his neck, under the collar, still carried the scars of 2 enemy rounds. President Harry Truman walked out to meet him. Truman was 61 years old, a former artillery captain from the First World War, a man who had known combat in his own way. President who had made the decision to drop the atomic bombs and who now stood in his own White House, placing medals around the necks of the boys who had made it through. The citation was read aloud. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. 12 pillboxes, 50 Japanese soldiers. The president looped the pale blue ribbon around Jackson's neck. The Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States can give, hung against his chest. Truman shook his hand. Photographers took pictures. Jackson smiled the way a young man smiles when he does not know what else to do with his face. He was 20 years old. He was going home. He thought the story was over. It was not. He served in northern China during the post-war occupation. He tried civilian life and found he could not stand it. He joined the Army Reserve. When Korea came, he went to Korea, still in uniform, still fighting the wars his country asked him to fight. He reached the rank of captain in 1954. In 1959, he transferred back to the Marine Corps, the service he had loved first, the service he had bled for as a boy. And this is where the story changes. You need to understand what happened next, because this is where the real Arthur Jackson begins. In September of 1961, Captain Arthur Jackson was stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. He was 36 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades in uniform. He was 18 months away from a full military pension, and on the night of the 30th of September 1961, everything he had built came apart. The story of what happened at Guantanamo has been told in different versions by different men, and honesty demands that we tell it that way here. The version the Marine Corps eventually accepted, the version reported by Time magazine in 1962, went something like this. There was a Cuban civilian who worked on the base. His name was Ruben Sabariego. Other Cuban employees had told the American officers that Sabariego was passing information to Castro's intelligence services. A spy, they said. That evening, Captain Jackson had been drinking at the officers' club with a young Marine lieutenant under his command, William A. Shilley. Jackson spoke to Sabariego. He warned him to stay away from restricted areas. Later that night, according to Shilley, Jackson found Sabariego near an ammunition storage area. He called Shilley for help. The two Marines took Sabariego to a long disused rear gate in the perimeter fence, meaning to release him back into Cuban territory. The gate's lock was rusted. Shilley went to find a sledgehammer. When Shilley returned, the gate was open. Sabariego was dead. He had been shot with a .45 caliber pistol. Jackson said Sabariego had attacked him after they crossed the fence. He said he had fired in self-defense. And then, instead of reporting what had happened, the two Marine officers made the decision that would end their careers. They recruited other men to help. They brought the body back onto the base. They buried it in a shallow grave lined with quicklime. Weeks later, at a cocktail party, someone said too much to the wrong person. The body was dug up. The investigation began. Jackson requested a court-martial. He wanted his day in a military court. He wanted his side of the story to be tested by evidence, in public, before the judgment of his peers. The Pentagon denied the request. A court-martial would have been public. A public trial would have handed Fidel Castro a propaganda victory the United States was not willing to give him at the height of the Cold War. So the case was closed quietly, and quietly Arthur Jackson was told to resign. 18 months short of his pension, he resigned. He moved to San Jose, California. He took a job carrying mail for the United States Postal Service, $90 a week. He was invited to the annual gathering of Medal of Honor recipients at the White House. He accepted. Then, when the news of Guantanamo broke in the press, he declined. He locked the doors of his house. He disconnected the telephone. He did not want to be photographed anymore. He did not want to be a hero anymore. He wanted to be left alone. For decades, he almost was. He worked. He raised a family. He walked with a limp that never quite went away. His neighbors in San Jose knew him as a quiet man who came home, tired at the end of the day, and did not talk about the war. Most of them never learned about the medal in the closet. Maybe he delivered mail to your grandmother. Maybe your father drank a beer with him at the VFW without ever knowing who he was drinking with. That was the shape of that generation. They came home, they took the ordinary jobs, they carried the extraordinary things quietly. He drifted back into the Army Reserve, served until the mid-1980s. Retired as a captain with more than 40 years of combined military service, counting every branch and every reserve billet he had passed through. He moved to Idaho, and somewhere in those quiet decades, something in him began to shift. He started to talk, not to reporters, not to biographers. He started to talk to school children, to veterans groups, to small rooms of ordinary people who wanted to know what it had really been like. He drove himself to the events. He wore a simple suit. He answered the questions patiently in his soft voice, and when children asked him the biggest question, the one they always ask, he always gave them the same answer. It's really nothing to talk about. In 2011, at 86 years old, he was invited aboard the USS Peleliu. She was an amphibious assault ship named after the battle where he had earned his medal. He walked her decks slowly with a cane. He spoke to more than 1,000 sailors and Marines assembled in the hangar bay. He told them about the 14-pound canned ham that his mess sergeant had made him carry ashore during the landing, a story that made them laugh. He told them briefly about the pillboxes. He told them about the men who did not come home. He presented the ship's captain with his Medal of Honor flag, one of only 2 he had ever received. The captain had it framed. It was placed in the ship's Hall of Heroes, alongside photographs of the 8 other Marines who had earned the Medal of Honor at Peleliu. Arthur Jackson was the last of them still alive. He looked at their pictures for a long time before he left the ship. On the 14th of June, 2017, in Boise, Idaho, Arthur Jackson died. He was 92 years old. Marine Corps body bearers from Bravo Company, Marine Barracks, Washington, carried his casket. He was buried with full military honors at the Idaho State Veterans Cemetery. The rifle volley echoed off the mountains. The bugler played taps. The men who fired the salute had not been born when he took the Medal of Honor. Their fathers had not been born, and still they stood at attention in dress blues, saluting a 19-year-old boy who had walked into 35 rifles alone on a coral island most Americans could not find on a map, because that is what the Marine Corps does. It remembers. 50 Japanese soldiers tried to kill one American Marine on the morning of the 18th of September, 1944. Every one of them died. That Marine lived 73 more years, and he spent most of those years not talking about what he had done. Not because he did not remember, because he remembered too well. That is the part that matters. Not the 12 pillboxes, not the 90 minutes, not the medal, not the parade, not even the ceremony at the White House. The part that matters is the 73 years of silence that came after. Because that is where the real weight of a man like Arthur Jackson lives. Not in what he did on his worst morning, but in how he carried it, quietly, faithfully, and without complaint for the rest of a long and complicated life. He was not a perfect man. Guantanamo will always be part of his story. The choices he made that night in 1961, and the choices he made in the days after, will always sit beside the choices he made in the coral on Peleliu. Honest history has to hold both truths at the same time, but this is also true. When his brothers were pinned down and dying, a 19-year-old boy from Portland, Oregon, took off his helmet, took off his pack, took off his leggings, and he walked into fire that no other man would face. He did what he did, and then for 73 years he lived with it. If this story meant something to you, remember his name, Arthur Jr. Jackson. Say it once, out loud, for the boy who walked into 35 rifles alone. Say it for the men he saved. Say it for the ones who never came home from Peleliu, and the ones who did come home and could not speak of it, and the ones who carried their war quietly into old age, into the small houses of America, into the mail routes, and the reserve drills and the quiet suppers with their wives, all the ordinary years that ordinary men fill with nothing more than doing the next thing. That was Arthur Jackson. That was his generation, and they are almost all gone now. The last thing we owe them is to remember.